Verse 6 of our gospel reading tells us that the Pharisees, could not understand Jesus. That illustration of the sheep, the shepherd, the gates, thieves, etc., it was just not going in. I mean, who are they kidding? I understood it. You understood it, yes? A blind man could understand it. Which coincidentally is probably where we need to start this morning, with a blind man. Because chapter 10 is a direct continuation of chapter 9. It's those pesky chapter divisions that get in our way. And you need to know chapter 9 a little bit to really get to grips with chapter 10. So we're going to start with a man who was born blind. And Jesus comes along and heals that man. It's the one with the mud. Yes? Yeah, where he spits on the ground, makes a mud patty, sticks it on his eyes, and it washes off, and the guy can see. Now, the Pharisees, they get wind of this, and as you can imagine, they're not too happy about it all. There's several reasons why they're not happy, and we'll sort of kick those around very quickly. One, it was done on a Sabbath, which you all know you don't do anything useful on a Sabbath, like heal people. They said he was in the league with Jesus. He couldn't possibly have been healed because he was never born blind in the first place. So they grab the parents in, and they interview the parents and say, "This man wasn't born blind, was he?" And the parents say, "Yeah, he was. We're not lying here." Then they say, "Well, you're in league with Jesus then?" And they say, "No, I'm not. I hardly knew him before this." And they said, "It couldn't have happened because he did it on a Sabbath. He's a sinner because he's not actually sort of following the Sabbath rules. God wouldn't have allowed that. Therefore, it didn't happen." Now, the blind man who is now miraculously being able to see turns around and says something like this: "Yeah, okay, God doesn't listen to sinners, fair enough, but this guy is doing things that God allows. Therefore, God is listening to a sinner. So he's either a sinner or he's doing something that God is wanting him to do. Which is it?" And you can tell he's cocky because the very next thing they do is they throw him out the synagogue. At this point, Jesus wanders along, says, "What's going on?" The man explains everything, as I imagine he does. Jesus then goes to the Pharisees, and he has a word with them. He has several words with them. One of the sentences he gives them is that famous one. Now, how does it go? "I've come so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." You know that one? Two of you do. Great. Okay. And the indignant and the self-righteous Pharisees, they can't help themselves at this point. On hearing that, they then say to Jesus, "Are we blind? Are we blind?" And that just opens the door for Jesus. And Jesus is then able to provide feedback to them, which he does. Now, feedback is a really interesting thing. I'm not a fan of it myself. But I have had to give feedback in the past, in a previous life. When I was head of department, I had to conduct various lesson observations, and I'd go in and I'd do the observation, and then I would provide constructive feedback on how things went and how they could improve. Now, on this particular occasion, I had to do what no head of department wants to do. I had to fail a lesson. It was just poor from start to finish, sort of thing. And I explained the rationale by why I did that. I suggested ways to improve for the future, reassured my colleague that things were not as bad as what they perceived to be, set up a time when we could revisit this and review the lesson again and work out how we can sort of move forward on this sort of thing, and so on. So I felt I did all the right things, more or less. But my colleague was very indignant about the whole thing. did not believe the grading system that I'd used and the information that I was providing for her. She was that gave it away. My colleague was a bit shouty and wanted to challenge every point that I made. My colleague believed that she was better than anything I was saying. What I had said bore no resemblance at all to her experience of herself. And she finished her rant by saying, "I've never failed anything in my life." Well, you have now. I said, at which point the penny dropped, for her at least. What she realised she was saying was that there could be no one in this world who could possibly help her improve in how she taught and worked the classroom and so on. In her mind, she had everything nailed down just the way that she wanted, and no one else's opinion mattered. But she had a choice. Work with me, and I was a pretty good head teacher, deputy head teacher and head of department and things. Wasn't I, Liz? Yeah, okay, fine. Good. Just a bit of validation there. Liz probably knows who I'm talking about anyway. Or continue with the same kind of mistakes that she was making and see where that gets her. Well, verse 6 tells us something similar to that kind of experience. I think they could not understand Jesus because, like my colleague, they'd never really been properly challenged before. They were so confident of their own superiority, both within their community and with their specialist knowledge of God, that nothing was going to get through to them. And when someone does challenge their perceptions, a barrier goes up, straight up, and they become hostile to the person giving the news, but more importantly, blind to the possibility that someone else could add value to their role. And that is a potential problem for all of us, and not just the Pharisees. And that's something we're going to explore in a moment or two. But back to the passage, and verse 7 tells us that Jesus is tenacious. He is not going to let them get off the hook. And he's going to go on with the illustrations. He's not going to switch it to something easier for them to understand. This is the right illustration for this moment. So he goes again. But this time he includes a few explanations along the way. Actually, it's a bit more than that. He is very clear about who he is in that illustration, and that makes it doubly obvious as to who they are. And more he expands on it, the more pointed he becomes, until verse 12, he says, the hired hand even, the hired hand is not the shepherd, and he will run away the moment the wolf arrives. Until finally in verse 19, which I know is a little bit outside what we had, finally in verse 19, they get it. The penny drops. My God, he really is talking about us. They actually say something quite offensive at this point, but that's by the by, because what they were actually expressing was the realization that they are the thieves and the bandits. They are the ones trying to break into the sheep pen. They are the ones who are being mischievous, calling sheep out of the pen, trying to lead them astray. But Jesus says the sheep aren't listening. And they're not going to listen to you anymore, because the true shepherd has come, and they are listening to him now. Jesus is the one true shepherd, and he will lead them safely to new pastures and an abundant life. And he will ultimately lay down his life for them in order to keep them safe. And when the Pharisees do get it, bang, outrage. Most are furious with him and call him all the names under the sun, refusing to listen to him anymore. But just a few, this is really good, just a few have their eyes opened to him and begin to reconsider. And that is the power of Jesus' feedback. Now, we can all be a bit Pharisee-like at times, particularly when we come at things from a position of strength and superiority. assured in our own righteousness, confident in where we stand in the church and elsewhere. And if we're surrounded by a bubble of like-minded friends and colleagues, it's possible that we could be making mistakes as well. So I think there are lessons here in this passage for us, as there were for the Pharisees. And I want to briefly touch on 3 things that I think can help us today. So let's start with that idea of a full life, an abundant life. Jesus says he came that we might have life and have it abundantly. What does that mean for you? Now keep in mind, however, that an abundant life is not something to do with quantity or wealth or success or approval or popularity or security or being number one or any of those other things that we often think of it. It's not about that. It's a way of living and of being. How many times have you gotten what you wanted and been what others have said you ought to be and done what others have encouraged you to do and been rewarded by society only to discover that it just doesn't feel enough? It doesn't quite fill that gap. It doesn't fill the emptiness that you might feel and the poverty that you might feel. Or if it does, it empties out really quickly and you have to look for something else to refill that gap. The abundant life that Jesus talks about is living the life that knows him. It's a quality, not quantity. The abundant life adds to life of others and the world. It's a life that leads to life, love that leads to love, joy that leads to joy, hope that leads to hope, kindness that leads to kindness, generosity that leads to generosity, beauty that leads to beauty, gratitude that leads to gratitude. It doesn't add to the pain of the world, but enhances and celebrates life with Jesus at its center. And what about those thieves and bandits that Jesus mentions? Jesus isn't warning us about losing things, about having things stolen from us. It's about having our life stolen and our abundance depleted. Thieves are stealthy. You don't see them coming. We don't often know they've been there until we wake up in the morning and find they've taken everything. We're asleep, we're unaware. And then one day we wake up and we wonder what happened to our life. How did we get to this point? Where did our life go? We don't know when or how it happened. Maybe time caught up with us. Maybe we took a relationship for granted. Maybe we were too comfortable, too complacent, too busy, too preoccupied. Maybe we weren't paying attention. Maybe we just gave up. Maybe we opened our heart to the wrong person or thing. Thieves are sneaky. They often wear the disguise of acceptance, whether it's work or money, productivity, knowledge, a relationship, and meeting other people's needs and expectations. There's nothing wrong with any of that until they begin to steal the life that Jesus intended for us. Robbers, bandits, on the other hand, they are overpowering. They come in the daylight. They don't even try to hide. You can see them riding in from over the hill. We know when they are here and when they are beginning to rob us, because it's those times we know in our life that our life is less than we want it to be. Maybe we have destructive patterns of behavior that influence and overwhelm choices that we make. Maybe we're choosing resentment and anger over forgiveness and concern. It's knowing what will give life, but refusing to give it. It's recognizing our brokenness, but refusing to ask for help. It's saying yes, when perhaps we should have said, hold on. We know there is a better and different choice to be made, but we continue down that same path, the path that will lead us further away from Jesus. The head may tell you that there is a better and wiser choice to be made, but it's the heart that inevitably makes that choice. And that's because the abundant life is always a matter of the heart. And finally, to what voices are we listening to? The voices that we listen to form and shape our lives throughout our lifetime. And there are myriad voices in our world. And what voices are rattling around inside of us, trying to grab our attention? For better or for worse, we eventually begin to speak with the voice that has formed and shaped our lives. So who do you sound like when you speak? Is it like a politician, or is it from the television, or the internet, or is it your friends, or is it money, or is it success, or is it popularity? Is it you're based on expectations? Is it your fear, or is it your anger coming out? Is it your feeling of failure? Self-criticism, is that coming out? Is it self-loathing in there? Is it self-hatred? All these things are vying for that attention. Is it the voice of thieves and bandits? Or is it the voice of wisdom that you can hear inside you now? Wisdom, life, love, compassion, beauty, generosity, hope, joy. The voice of Jesus, the voice of a shepherd. And which voices are loudest in you at the moment? What voices have you invested in? Are they worthy of your trust and of your life? Or are they bankrupting you, stealing from you? To which of those voices do you need to close the gate of your heart on? And which one do you need to open that gate to? There are no easy answers to any of these questions. It's rarely a simple tweak, but there are things that we can do to help ourselves. The Pharisees, they hardened their hearts to Jesus' words, blinded themselves to his help, unwilling to see themselves in his words, and unwilling to make that change that Jesus so desperately wants for the world and for them. He couldn't help them at that point because they didn't believe they needed his help. The blind man who Jesus healed at the start of that chapter saw all his solutions in Jesus. He had his eyes literally and figuratively opened up by Jesus. And when he had received from Jesus, he worshipped him and said, "Lord, I believe. Lord, I believe." Now, life is always going to be a series of choices. And in the mix, there are many, many other voices that will be vying for your attention. But somewhere in all that noise and commotion, there is one true shepherd. That's Jesus. And he is calling out to us, protecting us and providing for us. Jesus with his promise of an abundant life. And his sheep will follow because they know his voice. So it means that it's down to us to continue to make sure that we're always listening for Jesus, listening for his voice, because he will never stop calling us. And he will never stop doing that ever. Amen.